The people who change your life rarely arrive looking like heroes. Rain drummed against the cracked windshield as Grace Walker tightened both hands around the steering wheel, willing her 15-year-old sedan to make it just one more mile. The engine answered with a tired groan before the dashboard lit up like a Christmas tree. A warning chime echoed through the quiet cabin, followed by a sharp shudder that traveled from the hood to the worn fabric beneath her seat. 7-year-old Ethan looked up from the dinosaur book resting on his lap. "Mom, is the car okay?" Grace forced a smile that didn't quite reach her exhausted blue eyes. "She's just having a rough day, buddy. Kind of like us." The sedan rolled another few hundred feet before surrendering completely beside a small roadside garage on the outskirts of Cedar Ridge, Pennsylvania. Steam curled gently from beneath the hood, disappearing into the cool October air. Grace leaned her forehead against the steering wheel for a brief second. She had exactly $43 left until payday, a refrigerator that needed groceries, and a parent-teacher conference tomorrow morning before her shift at the local veterinary clinic. A major repair wasn't part of the plan. Then again, neither had becoming a single mother 3 years earlier. "Stay here for 1 minute," she told Ethan softly. Pulling her faded jacket tighter around herself, she stepped into the drizzle. The garage looked older than the surrounding buildings, its weathered wooden sign reading Morgan Auto Repair in peeling blue paint. The scent of motor oil mixed with rain drifted through the open service bay where an old country song played quietly from a dusty radio. Bent over the engine of a pickup truck was a man wearing grease-stained coveralls with the name Dan stitched above one pocket. He looked up only after finishing the bolt in his hand, calmly wiping his fingers with a faded shop towel before walking toward her. He wasn't dressed like someone trying to impress anyone. His boots were worn. His sleeves were rolled to his elbows. A trace of engine grease rested along one wrist. Yet there was something unexpectedly steady about him, the kind of quiet confidence that made people lower their voices without realizing it. "Car give up on you?" he asked with an easy smile. Grace let out a small laugh despite herself. "Looks like it picked today. They usually do." His voice carried the relaxed warmth of someone who had solved 1,000 bad days without making a big deal about any of them. Ethan cracked the passenger door open and peeked outside. "Mom." Before Grace could answer, the mechanic crouched until he was eye level with the little boy instead of towering over him. "Hey there," he said. "Mind if I take a look at your family's adventure machine?" Ethan grinned. "That's what Mom calls it." "Then it's officially an adventure machine." Grace noticed something unusual. Most strangers spoke to her first and her son second. This man had instinctively made Ethan feel included. It was such a small gesture that it almost hurt. Daniel Morgan, though everyone here simply called him Dan, lifted the hood and listened instead of immediately reaching for tools. His expression stayed thoughtful, almost patient, as though the old sedan deserved respect despite its age. After a minute, he nodded to himself. "Good news," he said. "I don't think your engine is dying." Grace released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Really? Looks more like a failed serpentine belt and a worn tensioner." He smiled when her face turned blank. "Translation? It's fixable." "How much?" she asked quietly, already calculating which bills would have to wait. Dan looked at Ethan watching through the window, then back at Grace. "Let's get you back on the road first." "I'd rather know." "Fair enough." He scratched the back of his neck. "Parts aren't expensive. Labor won't be either." Grace folded her arms. "People always say that before they hand me a bill." He chuckled. "Then maybe today's different." An hour later, the rain had softened into a mist. Ethan sat on an upside-down bucket inside the garage, proudly handing wrenches to Dan whenever he asked for one. Grace washed from nearby with a paper cup of coffee someone had quietly placed in her hands without asking if she wanted it. For the first time in weeks, Ethan laughed without forcing it. For the first time in months, Grace caught herself smiling without pretending. She didn't notice the black SUV that slowed almost imperceptibly across the street before driving away. She didn't notice the nervous glance exchanged between two men inside the vehicle. And she certainly didn't notice that the humble mechanic tightening the final bolt beneath her hood happened to be the missing CO every financial news network in America had been trying to find for the past 9 days. 3 days later, the old sedan rolled back into Morgan Auto Repair with a soft rattle coming from somewhere beneath the dashboard. Grace almost laughed as she pulled into the gravel lot. She had barely finished parking when Ethan unbuckled his seat belt with excitement. "Can I tell Dan about my science project?" he asked. "Only after he finishes helping his customers," Grace replied, although she already suspected the answer. Before she even reached the garage entrance, Dan looked up from replacing a brake pad and smiled as though he had been expecting them. "That adventure machine keeping you busy?" he asked. Grace folded her arms with playful suspicion. "You fixed one problem. Apparently the car found another one." Dan leaned through the open driver's door, listened carefully as she turned the key, and within seconds tapped the underside of the dashboard with 2 fingers. The faint rattle disappeared. "Loose panel," he said. "Nothing serious." Grace blinked. That is it. That is it. How much do I owe you?" He shook his head. "About 30 seconds of my afternoon." She frowned. "You cannot keep fixing things for free. Good thing that one did not need fixing." Ethan laughed so hard that even Grace could not stop smiling. The garage slowly became part of their weekly routine. Sometimes the sedan genuinely needed attention. Sometimes Grace simply stopped by after grocery shopping because Ethan insisted they say hello. Dan never seemed bothered by the interruptions. He always found time to answer Ethan's endless questions about engines, gears, and why every wrench looked almost the same. One chilly Saturday morning, he handed the boy an old spark plug. "Every mechanic keeps one that reminds him to pay attention," he explained. Ethan turned it over carefully like it was treasure. "Can I keep it?" Dan nodded. "Only if you promise to stay curious." "I promise." Grace watched the exchange while sipping coffee from a paper cup. She had not realized how long it had been since another adult had spoken to her son with such patience. Most people hurried children along. Dan slowed down for them. That difference stayed with her long after they drove away. Across town, inside the glass headquarters of Morgan Automotive Group, the atmosphere felt nothing like the quiet garage. Executives gathered around a polished conference table, staring at an empty chair at its head. 9 days, one board member muttered. "He has ignored every scheduled meeting." Another rubbed his forehead. "The investors are asking questions. The media is asking questions. We cannot keep saying the chief executive officer is conducting private field research forever." Daniel's executive assistant, Claire Bennett, calmly closed her tablet. Unlike everyone else, she knew exactly where her boss was. She also knew he had given one instruction before disappearing. "Do not interfere unless someone gets hurt." She remembered his final words perfectly. "Spreadsheets tell me how the company performs. Ordinary people tell me who we have become." Back at the garage, Dan quietly tightened the cap on a bottle of engine oil while his phone vibrated inside a locked toolbox. The screen briefly lit up with more than 20 missed calls, all from corporate executives. Without even looking at the names, he silenced it again. Grace noticed none of it. She was too busy watching Ethan proudly sweep the garage floor with a child-sized broom Dan had found in the storage room. "He likes helping," Grace said softly. Dan smiled without taking his eyes off the old pickup truck he was repairing. "Children usually do. Adults are the ones who forget." Grace looked around the modest garage filled with worn tools, old wooden shelves, and the comforting scent of motor oil. Somehow, despite its chipped paint and aging walls, it felt warmer than any place she had visited in years. She had come looking for someone to fix her car. Without realizing it, she had begun finding something much harder to replace. October slowly painted the trees around Cedar Ridge in shades of amber and crimson, and almost without noticing it, Grace found herself taking the longer route home whenever it passed Morgan Auto Repair. Sometimes the old sedan truly needed another adjustment. Other times, she simply wanted to make certain the strange vibration she imagined hearing was nothing serious. She knew she was inventing excuses, and somehow that embarrassed her more than the excuses themselves. Dan never questioned why she stopped by. He simply smiled, wiped his hands on the same faded shop towel, and listened patiently to every sound the car supposedly made. Most of the time he would nod thoughtfully, check 1 or 2 simple things, and send her home with nothing more than the advice to keep an eye on it. One crisp Friday afternoon, Ethan rushed into the garage carrying a paper grocery bag almost as big as he was. "Mom made extra chicken soup," he announced proudly. "She said you probably forget to eat lunch." Grace immediately blushed. "I did not say it like that." Dan accepted the bag with genuine surprise. "Then however you said it. Thank you." He peeked inside before letting out a quiet laugh. "My grandmother used to make soup exactly like this." Grace noticed something soften across his face for only a second before it disappeared beneath his usual calm expression. "She must have been a wonderful cook," Grace said gently. "She was," Dan replied. "She also believed nobody should work hungry." He carefully placed the bag inside the small office refrigerator as though it deserved more respect than an ordinary meal. While Dan finished replacing a tire on a customer's truck, Ethan wandered through the garage studying every tool hanging neatly along the wall. "Everything has its place," Dan explained after noticing the curious stare. "If you spend half your day looking for tools, you only spend half your day helping people." Ethan nodded seriously, storing the advice somewhere only children seem able to preserve forever. Grace leaned against the open garage door, watching sunlight stretch across the concrete floor while dry leaves rolled through the parking lot. "You really enjoy this, do not you?" she asked. Dan looked around the modest garage before answering. "Fixing things." Grace nodded. "Cars are honest," he said quietly. "They tell you what is wrong if you are willing to listen. People are usually much harder." The sentence lingered in Grace's mind longer than she expected. She wondered what kind of disappointments had taught him to say something like that. Before she could ask, a luxury SUV slowly entered the parking lot. A sharply dressed man stepped out holding a leather portfolio. His polished shoes looked strangely out of place beside oil stains and gravel. The moment he saw Dan, relief flashed across his face. "Sir," he began instinctively before catching himself. Dan met his eyes with the slightest shake of his head, almost too subtle to notice. The visitor corrected himself immediately. "Dan, I was passing through town and thought you might want those specialty parts you ordered." Dan accepted the sealed box without opening it. "Thank you. I appreciate the delivery." The man glanced briefly toward Grace and Ethan with quiet curiosity before returning to his vehicle. Within seconds, the expensive SUV disappeared down the road. Grace smiled. "You have customers driving vehicles worth more than my house." Dan shrugged with an easy grin. "Everyone needs a mechanic sooner or later." She laughed, accepting the explanation without another thought. But across the county line, inside that departing SUV, the visitor finally exhaled after several miles of silence. He reached for his phone and spoke only one sentence to the woman waiting anxiously on the other end of the call. "Claire, he is still there. And for the first time in years, I have seen him smile like an ordinary man." The first snow of the season had not arrived yet, but the mornings carried enough frost to leave a thin layer of silver across the windshields parked outside Morgan Auto Repair. Grace had begun bringing Ethan to the garage every Wednesday after his piano lesson, and somehow the place had become part of their routine without either of them ever deciding it should. Ethan hurried inside, carrying a small cardboard model car he had built for school. "Dan, I finally finished it," he said proudly. Dan carefully washed the grease from his hands before accepting the model with the same attention another person might have given an expensive gift. He turned it over slowly, studying every folded edge. "You remembered the suspension," he said with genuine admiration. Ethan's face lit up. "You noticed?" A good mechanic notices the little things. Grace stood quietly near the coffee machine, watching the conversation unfold. She realized Ethan had begun standing a little taller over the past few weeks. He smiled more easily. He asked more questions. The quiet loneliness that had followed him since the divorce seemed to fade each time they visited the garage. She wondered if Dan understood how much those simple afternoons meant to her son. She was beginning to suspect he understood far more than he ever said. Later that afternoon, after Grace and Ethan drove away, the familiar silence returned to the garage. Dan locked the front office, removed his stained work gloves, and finally picked up the phone he had ignored for nearly 2 weeks. "Claire," he said calmly. The voice on the other end answered almost immediately. "Daniel, the board meeting is tomorrow morning. They are demanding answers." He glanced across the quiet service bays before speaking. "Send me the dealership satisfaction reports instead." Claire sighed softly. "That is what you want to discuss?" "No," Daniel replied. "That is what I want to understand." She paused before asking the question that had been waiting for days. "Have you found what you were looking for?" Daniel looked toward the empty parking lot where Grace's aging sedan had disappeared only an hour earlier. "Not completely," he answered. "But I have discovered what we stopped measuring, which is kindness." Several hundred miles away in the executive boardroom of Morgan Automotive Group, polished marble floors reflected the morning sunlight, while anxious executives argued over quarterly forecasts and shareholder expectations. Charts filled enormous screens. Revenue projections climbed upward. Profit margins looked healthy. Yet Daniel knew those numbers hid stories no spreadsheet could reveal. He had spent years building one of the most successful automotive companies in America, but somewhere along the way he realized the company understood vehicles better than it understood people. That was why he disappeared. Not to escape responsibility, but to see the business through ordinary eyes. The next morning, before sunrise, a black sedan quietly stopped behind the garage. Claire stepped out carrying a slim folder instead of the usual stack of corporate documents. She handed it to Daniel without mentioning his title. "Everything requiring your signature," she said. He quickly reviewed several pages before signing them against the hood of an old pickup truck with the same pen he used to write repair estimates. "Anything urgent?" he asked. Claire hesitated. "Only one thing." She smiled ever so slightly. "The employees keep saying the company feels different whenever you visit the shops instead of the boardroom." Daniel closed the folder. "Perhaps I have been spending too much time in boardrooms." As Claire drove away, another familiar sound echoed through the morning air. Grace's sedan rolled slowly into the parking lot, followed by Ethan's excited wave through the passenger window. Daniel instinctively smiled before they had even stepped out of the car. For the first time in years, the most important part of his day was not waiting inside a skyscraper covered in glass. It was arriving in a weathered family sedan with faded paint, a curious little boy, and a woman who still believed he was simply the mechanic who never let anyone drive away feeling alone. By the middle of November, the garage no longer felt like a place Grace happened to visit. It had quietly become part of her family's life. Ethan counted Wednesdays more eagerly than weekends, and Grace often caught herself smiling before she even turned into the gravel driveway. The old sedan behaved better than it had in years, leaving her with very few legitimate reasons to stop by. Yet somehow there was always fresh coffee waiting, another conversation that lasted longer than expected, or another excuse to ask Dan a question that had nothing to do with cars. One Saturday afternoon, Ethan stood beside Dan, carefully polishing the chrome bumper of a restored pickup truck. "Do you ever get tired of fixing the same problems?" the little boy asked. Dan smiled while tightening the cloth in his hand. "No two people bring the same story with their car," he replied. "Sometimes they are late for work. Sometimes they are taking someone they love to the hospital. Sometimes they are just trying to get home. I am not really fixing engines. I am helping people keep moving." Grace heard every word while unpacking homemade apple muffins onto the small table inside the office. She had spent years believing kindness always came with conditions because that was what life had taught her after the divorce. Yet this man never seemed to expect anything in return. He simply showed up, listened carefully, and treated everyone with the same quiet respect. As the afternoon sun filtered through the dusty garage windows, Ethan wandered outside to play with a friendly golden retriever that belonged to a neighboring business. For the first time in weeks, Grace and Dan found themselves alone. The silence between them felt surprisingly comfortable. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said. Dan leaned against the workbench and nodded. "Anything." She hesitated before speaking. "You have never talked about your family." He looked down at the coffee cup, warming his hands. "There is not much to tell. Everyone has a story." He smiled faintly. "Mine became very busy. Somewhere along the way I forgot how to make room for people." Grace studied his face. There was sadness there, but not bitterness. It looked more like someone remembering a road they should have taken years ago. "You still can," she said softly. Their eyes met for a brief moment before Ethan's laughter drifted across the parking lot like music carried on the cold breeze. Both of them instinctively turned toward the sound. Ethan was chasing the dog in wide circles, laughing so hard he nearly lost his knit hat. Dan watched with an expression Grace had never seen before. It was peaceful, almost longing. "He is a wonderful kid," Dan said quietly. "He is," Grace answered. "He has been through more than a child should, but somehow he still believes every new day can be better." Dan nodded slowly. "Maybe that is because he has a mother who believes it too, even when she is tired." Grace felt her throat tighten. No one had noticed her quiet strength in a very long time. Most people complimented how hard she worked or how responsible she was. Dan noticed the hope she fought to keep alive. That meant more than she could explain. Later that evening, after Grace and Ethan drove home beneath a sky filled with bright winter stars, Dan remained alone inside the silent garage. He looked at the empty paper plate that had once held apple muffins and smiled to himself. His phone buzzed again with another message from Claire reminding him about an upcoming corporate event he could no longer postpone. He read the message, locked the screen, and slipped the phone back into his pocket without replying. For the first time in many years, the life waiting for him inside towering office buildings felt strangely distant, while the simple moments shared inside a weathered garage had begun to feel like the home he had spent years searching for without ever realizing it. The week before Thanksgiving arrived with freezing rain and skies that stayed gray long after sunrise. Grace finished her shift at the veterinary clinic exhausted, carrying a grocery list that seemed to grow longer every time she looked at it. As she unlocked her sedan, her phone rang. The number belonged to her bank. She answered with quiet hope, but the conversation ended almost as quickly as it began. Rising insurance costs and missed payments after unexpected medical expenses had placed her auto loan under review. Unless she caught up within 30 days, the bank warned that they might begin the repossession process. Grace thanked the representative politely before ending the call. She remained standing beside her car for several moments, staring at her reflection in the rain-speckled window. Losing the car would mean losing reliable transportation to work. Losing reliable transportation could mean losing the job that kept a roof over Ethan's head. She folded the notice into her purse without saying a word to her son. Later that afternoon, she drove to the garage, not because the car needed attention, but because it had quietly become the one place where the weight on her shoulders felt lighter. Dan noticed immediately that something was different. Grace smiled when she greeted him, but the smile disappeared almost as quickly as it appeared. "Long day?" he asked while setting aside the socket wrench in his hand. "Just one of those weeks," she answered. He nodded without pressing for details. Somehow he always seemed to understand that silence sometimes needed companionship more than questions. Ethan wandered toward the workbench, excited to continue building the small wooden toolbox Dan had promised to help him finish before Christmas. Their cheerful conversation filled the garage while Grace sat alone with a warm cup of coffee, trying to calculate impossible numbers in her notebook. Dan glanced over several times before quietly walking toward her. "You are balancing more than a budget," he said gently. Grace looked up, surprised. "Is it that obvious?" "Only to someone who has done the same thing." She gave him a tired smile. "The bank called today." She stopped there, embarrassed to say more. Dan waited patiently. Finally she whispered, "If I lose the car, everything becomes harder." He looked through the garage window toward the aging sedan parked outside. He knew exactly how simple it would be to erase every financial burden she carried. One phone call could pay off the loan, replace the vehicle, even purchase a new home if he wanted. Yet he also knew that unexpected generosity from a stranger could raise questions she was not ready to ask. More importantly, he wanted her trust, not her gratitude. "We will keep it running as long as it keeps showing up," he said with a reassuring smile. "Sometimes that is the first step." Grace laughed softly. "You make it sound like cars have personalities." "Some of them do." Before either of them could continue, Ethan hurried toward them carrying the half-finished wooden toolbox. "Look," he said proudly. "Dan says every mechanic needs a place to keep the right tools." Grace admired the careful craftsmanship before brushing a loose strand of hair away from Ethan's forehead. "It is beautiful." "It is for you," Ethan said. "So you have somewhere to keep important things." Grace felt her eyes fill with unexpected tears. She hugged her son tightly while Dan quietly looked away, giving them the privacy of that small moment. Across town, Claire Bennett sat inside Morgan Automotive headquarters reviewing tomorrow's schedule when another urgent message appeared from the board of directors. The annual product launch gala could no longer be postponed, and the chief executive officer's attendance was mandatory. She stared at Daniel's name printed across the invitation before slowly closing the folder. She already knew the peaceful world he had built inside the little garage was about to collide with the powerful life he had left behind, and neither of those worlds would remain unchanged once they finally met. The morning of the Morgan Automotive winter product launch began like any other day inside the small garage. Frost clung to the windows, coffee brewed quietly in the office, and Ethan proudly hung a handmade paper snowflake near the front counter. Grace arrived carrying a box of fresh cinnamon rolls she had baked before sunrise. "Breakfast for the hardest-working mechanic in Pennsylvania," she teased. Dan laughed as he accepted the box. I should warn you, this mechanic has become spoiled. That is because someone keeps refusing to charge me for loose dashboard panels. Their laughter filled the garage until the familiar vibration of Dan's phone interrupted the moment. He glanced at the screen. Claire. He let the call ring once before answering. I know, he said quietly. I will be there. Grace noticed the change in his expression. It was subtle, but the easy calm she had come to recognize was suddenly replaced by quiet responsibility. Everything okay? She asked. Dan nodded after a brief pause. There is something I have to take care of today. Ethan looked disappointed. Will you still help me finish my toolbox? Dan knelt beside him with an apologetic smile. I promise I will. Just not this afternoon. Ethan held out his little finger. Promise. Dan hooked his finger around Ethan's without hesitation. Promise. Less than an hour later, Grace drove across town to deliver medication to a longtime client of the veterinary clinic. Traffic unexpectedly slowed near the downtown convention center, where luxury vehicles lined the entrance beneath enormous banners displaying the Morgan Automotive logo. Curious, she glanced toward the building as dozens of reporters gathered behind security barriers. They must be launching a new truck, she whispered to herself. Before she could continue driving, a familiar black SUV turned into the restricted entrance. It was the same vehicle she had once seen outside the garage. Her curiosity deepened when the rear passenger door opened. Dan stepped out wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit instead of oil-stained coveralls. For one impossible second, Grace convinced herself it had to be someone who only resembled him. Then he turned his head. It was unmistakably him. The security staff immediately straightened their posture. Executives waiting near the entrance walked forward at once. Several extended their hands. Others respectfully stepped aside. Grace watched through her windshield as every conversation around him suddenly stopped. One elderly executive smiled warmly before saying words she could hear even through the closed windows because the microphones carried them across the entrance plaza. Good morning, Mr. Morgan. We are honored to have you back. Grace's hands froze around the steering wheel. Her heartbeat seemed louder than the traffic surrounding her. Mr. Morgan. The name echoed through her mind again and again. She looked from the towering company logo hanging above the convention center back to the man she thought she knew. Dan did not correct anyone. He simply nodded politely before walking inside, surrounded by executives who treated him with unmistakable respect. The glass doors closed behind him, leaving Grace staring at her own reflection in the windshield. Every memory from the past several weeks rushed back at once. The mysterious visitor at the garage, the expensive SUV, the unanswered phone calls, the calm confidence that had never quite matched the life of an ordinary mechanic. None of it had been coincidence. She felt neither anger nor relief at first, only disbelief. Across the convention hall, Daniel walked toward the brightly lit stage where thousands of employees, dealers, investors, and journalists waited for the annual presentation to begin. As applause filled the enormous room, he should have been thinking about product announcements, company strategy, and the future of one of the largest automotive corporations in America. Instead, his thoughts remained fixed on a weathered garage, a little boy building a wooden toolbox, and a woman whose trust suddenly felt far more fragile than any business empire he had ever built. Grace barely remembered the drive home. The traffic lights changed from red to green, cars moved around her, and holiday decorations glowed across downtown Cedar Ridge, but everything outside her windshield seemed strangely distant. The only words she could still hear were the ones spoken outside the convention center. Mr. Morgan. They echoed through her thoughts with painful clarity. By the time she reached her apartment, Ethan immediately noticed something was wrong. Mom, are you sick? He asked softly. Grace forced a gentle smile and brushed a hand across his hair. No, sweetheart. I am just tired. That evening her phone rang twice. The first call came from an unfamiliar number. She already knew who it was before the voicemail notification appeared. The second call came an hour later. She let that one go unanswered as well. The following morning the garage remained closed. The familiar lights were off. The service bay doors stayed locked. Grace stood outside for a long moment with Ethan beside her before quietly placing the unfinished wooden toolbox on the front step. Maybe Dan is busy, Ethan whispered. Grace nodded, even though she knew the truth was far more complicated. As they turned to leave, the sound of another vehicle entered the parking lot. A simple gray pickup truck rolled to a stop beside them. Daniel stepped out wearing jeans, an ordinary flannel jacket, and the same worn work boots he had always worn at the garage. There was no security team, no expensive suit, no cameras, only silence. "Grace," he said gently. She looked at him without anger, but also without the easy warmth that had once come naturally. "How long?" she asked quietly. Daniel understood exactly what she meant. From the beginning. She lowered her eyes for a moment before asking another question. Was any of it real? He answered without hesitation. Every conversation, every cup of coffee, every afternoon with Ethan, every smile, every single one. Grace folded her arms tightly against the cold wind. "You watch me worry about bills. You watch me wonder how I would keep my car. You listen while I talked about everything happening in my life." Her voice never became louder. Somehow that hurt even more. "And every time, you already knew you could solve every problem with one signature." Daniel looked down for a brief moment before meeting her eyes again. "I could have solved your financial problems in 5 minutes." He paused. "But I could not buy your trust after that." Grace remained silent. Daniel took one careful step closer. "If I had introduced myself as the chief executive officer of Morgan Automotive, would you have brought homemade soup to the garage?" She slowly shook her head. "No." "Would Ethan have asked me to help him build a wooden toolbox because he thought I was simply someone who liked fixing things?" Again she answered honestly. "Probably not." Daniel's voice grew even quieter. "I never lied about caring for you. I never pretended to enjoy those afternoons. The only thing I hid was my last name and everything attached to it." A cold breeze carried several dry leaves across the empty parking lot. Ethan looked from one adult to the other before stepping closer to Daniel. "Are you still my friend?" he asked with innocent concern. Daniel knelt until they were eye level. "Always." Ethan nodded as though that answer settled everything. Children often found simplicity where adults found impossible questions. Grace watched the exchange with tears gathering in her eyes. She realized the man before her had never changed. The mechanic who patiently listened to old engines and the billionaire who led one of the largest companies in America were the same person. The difference was not who he had become. The difference was what he had chosen to hide. Daniel reached into the pocket of his jacket and carefully placed a single key on the workbench beside the unfinished wooden toolbox. "This is the key to the garage," he said softly. "Not because I expect forgiveness today, because no matter what you decide tomorrow, this place became home the day you and Ethan walked through those doors." He stepped back without asking for another chance, leaving the choice entirely in Grace's hands for the first time since fate had quietly brought their lives together. Spring arrived quietly in Cedar Ridge. The last traces of winter disappeared from the sidewalks. Fresh green leaves returned to the maple trees, and warm sunlight once again spilled across the gravel parking lot outside Morgan Auto Repair. The little garage looked almost exactly the same as it had months before, except for one small change. A handmade wooden sign hung beside the entrance that read, "Coffee is always fresh." Ethan had painted every letter himself. Inside, the familiar sound of tools echoed gently through the building. Daniel stood beneath the raised hood of an old pickup truck, his sleeves rolled up just as they had been on the day Grace first met him. The expensive suits had returned whenever business demanded them, but every Friday afternoon and every Saturday morning, he still chose the garage over the boardroom. His executives eventually stopped questioning the decision. They had learned that the company performed better when its leader remembered the people who actually drove the cars they built. Across the parking lot, another familiar engine pulled in. Grace stepped out of the same aging sedan, although it now ran more smoothly than it had in years. She smiled as Ethan jumped from the passenger seat carrying a small tray of fresh blueberry muffins. The little cafe Grace had opened beside the garage had become a favorite stop for travelers passing through town. She had accepted Daniel's advice, but not his money. When he quietly offered to invest, she thanked him and declined. Instead, he introduced her to a community business program that supported local entrepreneurs without special treatment. She wanted to succeed on her own. Daniel admired her even more because of that decision. Ethan hurried across the garage and proudly placed the muffins on the workbench. "These are still warm," he announced. Daniel laughed. "Then we should probably rescue them before they cool off." Grace walked in behind her son, breathing in the familiar scent of fresh coffee and motor oil that somehow now reminded her of home. She looked around the garage before meeting Daniel's eyes. "Business looks good," she said. He smiled. "It is." Then he looked toward the crowded cafe next door, where customers laughed beneath bright umbrellas. "Yours looks even better." Grace laughed softly. "People keep telling me the mechanic next door recommended the coffee. I only recommend places I trust." For a brief moment, neither of them spoke. They no longer needed long explanations. Trust had returned slowly, built one ordinary day at a time rather than through grand promises. Daniel had never tried to buy forgiveness. Instead, he had shown up exactly as he always had, fixing engines, helping neighbors, teaching Ethan, and proving that the man she met in the garage had never disappeared behind the title of Chief Executive Officer. Ethan suddenly ran back outside before returning with the little wooden toolbox they had finished together months earlier. The wood was slightly worn from use, and every compartment now held carefully organized baking tools instead of mechanics' tools. "Mom keeps her best recipes in here," he said proudly. Daniel smiled. "Looks like it found the right owner." Grace gently rested one hand on the lid of the toolbox before looking at Daniel. "You were right about one thing." He raised an eyebrow. "Only one." She laughed. "Home is not a place you buy. It is a place where people keep choosing each other." Daniel nodded slowly, understanding every word. Outside, the afternoon sun settled over the garage and the little cafe standing side by side, one filled with the sound of engines, the other with the aroma of fresh bread, both connected by the people who had transformed them into something far more valuable than businesses. Travelers passing through Cedar Ridge often assumed the successful entrepreneur next door and the humble mechanic had always shared that little corner of town. They never knew how unlikely the story truly was. But perhaps that was the lesson hidden inside ordinary days. Wealth could build impressive buildings, but kindness built the places people never wanted to leave. And sometimes the greatest blessing in life arrived disguised as nothing more than an old car that refused to keep driving.